poor Nanny was hired by an alpha king to care for his daughter, then he fell for her. There is an old saying among the wolfless women of the Ashvan valleys, passed down in whispers, because no one powerful enough ever bothered to shout it. A candle does not need to be a bonfire to light the dark. Maren Voss had heard it first from her grandmother, who had pressed it into her palm like a coin on the morning she died. Maren was 11 then, standing in a drafty cottage that smelled of dried lavender and wood smoke, and she had not yet learned what it meant to be the kind of person the world overlooked. She learned soon enough. She learned it in every hiring hall where the wolf-blooded candidates stepped forward first. She learned it in every pack village where the unmated, wolfless women were quietly moved to the edges of ceremony. She learned it in the particular silence that followed, whenever she introduced herself, that half-second pause, that flicker of reassessment, that barely concealed recalibration of worth. But she had kept the saying, the way she kept every small, stubborn thing she valued. She kept it tucked behind her ribs, next to the warmth she refused to surrender. She could not have known on the gray November morning she answered the advertisement posted on the hiring board in Ashvan's lower market, that a small girl in a tower and a king who had forgotten how to see anything clearly would be the ones to finally prove her grandmother right. Chapter 1. The advertisement. The card was cream-colored, which was already unusual. Most postings on the lower market board were scrawled on rough brown paper. This one was engraved with a border of thin black lines, and it read in formal language that the household of Valdric Kyle, Alpha King of the Thornreach Packs, required a live-in governess and primary caregiver for one child, age 6, named Soli Kyle. Candidates were to present themselves at the Thornreach Estate Gatehouse by the second hour past dawn on the 14th. No wolves required. A wage was listed at the bottom, and it was the kind of number that made Maren's breath catch, not because it was extravagant, but because it was enough. Precisely, barely, carefully enough to cover what she needed. Her younger brother Call's treatment at the Ashvan Healer Clinic cost more each month than most families earned. He was 18 and slowly improving from a bone fever that had taken 2 years of their mother's savings before she passed, and then 2 more years of Maren's, and there was still a long way to go. Maren was 24 and had been working since she was 15, first in a bakery, then as a housemaid, then as a nanny to a merchant family's 3 children who had let her go when they moved inland. She was good at caring for things. She had been told this more times than she had been told she was beautiful, or capable, or worth anything particular, and she had made her peace with it the way you make peace with weather. She copied the address onto her wrist in ink because she had no paper, and walked home to her rented room above the fishmonger's shop to press the wrinkles out of her one good blouse. On the morning of the 14th, she arrived at the Thornreach Gatehouse to find 11 other women already waiting. Every one of them was wolf-blooded. She could tell by the way they stood, that particular ease of people who had never needed to justify their right to occupy space. Several of them glanced at her and glanced away. One leaned toward a companion and said something behind her hand. Maren looked at the iron gates and the long gravel drive beyond them, and the gray stone house at the end of it, enormous against the winter sky, and she pressed her grandmother's saying behind her ribs where she kept it, and she waited her turn. Chapter 2. The King Who Forgot to Look. Valdric Kale conducted the interviews in a room that was too large for interviews. It had been designed for councils, for treaty signings, for the occasions that required an Alpha King to look like a wall that refused to move. He sat behind a table of dark wood, and he looked exactly like that wall, immovable, uninterested, and exhausted in a way that had calcified into something resembling coldness. He was 32 and had been Alpha King for 7 years, and for 4 of those years he had been raising Soli alone. His mate, Riva, had died 18 months after Soli was born, from a complication no healer had seen coming, and grief had done what grief does to powerful men who have no language for it. It had made him very good at everything except the things that mattered most. His packs were well administered. His borders were secure. His daughter had a warm bedroom and excellent meals, and a rotating series of caregivers who each lasted, on average, 4 months before quietly handing in their notice. His steward, a careful older man named Prosper, had stopped asking why they left and simply arranged the next round of interviews. Each woman was given 8 minutes. Valdrick asked the same 5 questions. He was not unkind, precisely. He was simply somewhere else, reviewing trade agreements in a corner of his mind while his mouth produced the expected sounds. When Maren Voss entered, he did not look up immediately from the paper in front of him. When he did, he registered her in the way he registered most things he had already decided about. Young, plainly dressed, no pack insignia, no wolf bloom in the eyes. He noted she was small and brown-haired, and that there was a smudge of ink on the inside of her left wrist. He asked his 5 questions. She answered them. He was already moving on in his mind when she said, as though simply completing a thought, "Might I ask about Souley? The advertisement said she is 6. What does she like?" He stopped. In 4 hours of interviews, not one other candidate had asked that. "She likes," he began, and paused, because the honest answer was that he was not entirely sure anymore, and the truth of that landed on him like a stone dropped from a height. "She likes drawing. I believe she draws. What does she draw?" Another pause. "Animals. She draws animals." Maren nodded as though this was a complete and satisfying answer, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she did not fill the silence with performance. She simply waited, as though she had all the time in the world, as though she was willing to sit here until he remembered the rest of his daughter. He looked at her for the first time, actually looked, and there was something in her stillness that was not meekness. It was patience, which is a different thing entirely. "The position is yours," he said before Prosper had finished writing the notes from the previous candidate. Prosper looked up from his ledger with an expression he was too professional to let become a smile. Chapter 3. Souley. The child was hiding under her bed when Maren arrived at her room. This was information the previous nanny had apparently failed to note in any formal record, but which Maren discovered on her own after 5 minutes of gentle knocking and careful listening to the silence on the other side of the door, which was the kind of silence a small person makes when trying very hard not to breathe. Maren sat down on the floor in the hallway, her back against the doorframe, and spoke toward the gap at the bottom of the door. "I'm not going to come in until you're ready," she said. "I'll wait here. I brought some charcoal pencils from the market in Ashven. I left them on the tray outside your door. You don't have to take them." She had, in fact, bought the charcoal pencils with her own money before arriving, because the advertisement had said the child liked drawing, and Maren had learned years ago that the fastest way into a frightened child's trust was not coaxing or brightness or performed cheerfulness, but proof. Small, material, repeatable proof that someone had thought of them specifically. She heard the softest possible sound, the slide of small hands on wooden floor, the adjustment of weight. 20 minutes later, the pencils were gone from the tray. By evening, she had been shown, in great seriousness, a sketchbook full of animals with large eyes and careful fur textures, each one labeled in a child's uncertain printing. There was a wolf labeled wolf. There was a bird labeled brid. There was something with very long ears that was labeled rabbit, and had the most fur of all. "This one is my favorite," Maren said, pointing to the rabbit. "His name is Tomb," Souley said. "He lives in the garden, but he's shy." "Like you?" Souley considered this with the gravity of someone who did not like being obvious. "A little," she allowed. She was a small, serious girl with her father's coloring, dark hair, gray eyes, but something in her expression that was softer and watchful in a way he had perhaps not yet learned to be. She had a particular habit of tilting her head when listening, as though she was receiving sound slightly differently than other people. She had been lonely, Maren understood at once, not in the way of a neglected child, but in the way of a child whose primary adult was present and absent in equal, confusing measure. She needed someone who would stay. Every previous nanny had not stayed. Souley had, quite sensibly, stopped assuming they would. "I'll be here in the morning," Maren said when she tucked her in the simple, specific way she had learned some children needed. Not "I'll always be here," which was a promise no one should make on a first night, but tomorrow. Specific, verifiable. Souley looked at her from beneath the quilt, with gray eyes that were measuring and hopeful, in the way that only children who have been disappointed can be hopeful. Okay, she said. Chapter 4. The House and Its Silences. 3 weeks passed, and then 4, and Maren began to understand the architecture of the house's grief. It was not a cold house on the surface. The fires were well laid, the meals were good, the staff were professional and mostly kind. But there were rooms on the east wing that were never opened, and no one discussed them. There was a painting in the main hall of a woman with dark curling hair and the wolf glow bright in her eyes, and Maren had been there 2 weeks before she realized that none of the staff ever looked directly at it. Not out of unkindness, but because looking at it reminded them that their Alpha King had never found his way back from the edge of something. Valdric was present in the house, in the way a storm is present in the distance, always there, large and generating weather, but rarely arriving. He came to Soli's room each evening at exactly the same time, stayed for exactly 12 minutes, and then returned to his study. Maren had been there 3 times when this happened. He was not unkind to Soli. He kissed her forehead and answered her questions, and listened when she showed him drawings. But there was a thin wall of glass between them that she could see him trying to reach through and failing, and she could see Soli feeling it and not knowing how to name it. Once, in the 4th week, he passed Maren in the hall on his way back from Soli's room and stopped. "She seems better," he said. Maren looked at him. "She seems like herself." He frowned, not unkindly, as though this was a sentence he needed to translate. "Is that different?" "It's different from performing fine," Maren said. "She was performing fine before." He was quiet for a moment, standing in the stone corridor with the lamplight making a study of his face. He was handsome in the way of very tired men who were handsome before everything became a duty, structurally, under the weight of it. "How do you tell the difference?" he asked. "You watch," Maren said simply. "You watch the specific child, not the general idea of how a child should seem." He looked at her for a beat too long, and then he nodded and walked away, and she stood there a moment longer, listening to his footsteps go quiet on the stone. Chapter 5. What he began to see. It started without ceremony, as most real things do. He began appearing in places he had not appeared before. He came to the garden on a Tuesday morning when Maren was teaching Soli to identify winter plants by pressing them between paper, and he did not announce himself or ask to join. He simply sat on the low stone wall nearby with what appeared to be a sheaf of documents, and then did not look at the documents. He watched Soli crowing over a sprig of frost-whitened rosemary, and he watched Maren's hands, small and ink-stained, guiding her without hovering, leaving the discovery to the child. He came to dinner in the small family dining room instead of taking his meals in the study, the first time on a Wednesday, and then without explanation every subsequent day. Soli was alarmed at first, and then quietly overjoyed in the way she managed joy, contained, interior, but visible to anyone watching. He was, Maren realized, beginning to watch. He was learning it. He was terrible at it still. He asked questions in the too large formal way he'd probably learned in council chambers, and sometimes he misjudged Soli's energy and pushed when she needed space. But he was doing it. He was choosing to do it, which was the part that mattered. And he was watching Maren, though she suspected he did not fully know this yet. She caught it in peripheral moments. The way he paused in doorways rather than passing through. The way a conversation about household logistics would run past its necessary end and into something that was just talking. He asked her once where she had learned to be so unhurried, and she told him honestly that she had grown up unhurried by necessity, that when you had no wolf speed, no pack prestige to stride through the world on, you learned to take the pace of things and find what was available there. He was quiet for a moment after that. "I keep mistaking speed for competence," he said, and she understood that he was not talking about her. "Most people with power do," she said. "Speed looks like certainty." "And isn't it?" "No." She looked at him steadily. "Certainty is something different. It's quieter." He looked at her with an expression she did not have a name for yet. Not desire, exactly, or not only that. It was something anterior to desire. It was the expression of a person who has been lost for a long time and has just seen, in the middle of ordinary terrain, something that looks remarkably like a landmark. Chapter 6. The East Wing. It was Soli who opened the door in the way that children are agents of the things adults are afraid to do. She had found the key in a drawer she was not supposed to open, and she had led Marin to the East Wing on a gray Saturday afternoon while Valdric was in meetings, and she had said with the particular gravity of a 6-year-old conducting important business, "This is Mama's room. Nobody goes in, but I think I want to." Marin understood that this was not a decision she should make alone. "Let's ask your father first," she said, and because Soli's face did the complicated calculus of a child who feared that asking would mean no, Marin added, "Together. You and I will ask together." They found him in his study, and Soli stood before his desk and said, "I want to go into Mama's room. Marin says to ask you." The silence that followed was the longest Marin had been present for in this house. Valdric's face did something complex and quiet. He looked at Soli, and then he looked at Marin, and she held his gaze and offered nothing except presence. No reassurance, no pressure, nothing except the steady signal that she was there, and that this was his to navigate. "All right," he said finally, not to Marin, to Soli. "All right, I'll come with you." Marin waited in the hallway. Later, she did not know how much later, because she had taken up a book from a nearby shelf and let time go fluid. The door opened, and Soli came out carrying a small watercolor painting in a wooden frame. A rabbit with very long ears, done in the particular loose way of someone painting from memory rather than observation, and clearly painted with love. "Mama drew too," Soli said, holding it up. Her voice was whole, not broken by the information, but completed by it somehow. She liked animals too. Valdric appeared in the doorway behind her. His eyes were red at the edges. He met Marin's gaze over Soli's head, and he mouthed something that might have been "thank you," and she understood that he did not only mean about the room. Chapter 7. The night. It changed. Winter deepened, and one night a storm came in fast from the north, the kind that shut the Thornreach estate in behind walls of white and made the old stone house feel smaller and more necessary. Soli had been afraid of storms since a lightning incident the previous year, and she woke at midnight. Marin went to her immediately. This was already established, already known, already one of the reliable coordinates of Soli's world. And she brought her downstairs to the main kitchen where the range was still warm, and she made warm milk with honey and a small amount of the spiced powder she kept in her own belongings, because it was a recipe her mother had made, which she had made for her, and which was the most reliable comfort she knew. She had been there perhaps 20 minutes when Valdric appeared in the kitchen doorway, in a shirt untucked, clearly having heard Soli's initial cry from wherever sleep had found him. He stopped when he saw them, Soli tucked against Marin's side on the kitchen bench, both of them looking at a book of illustrated animals that Marin had retrieved from Soli's shelf, and his expression was the one she still did not have a full name for. He came and sat on the other side of Soli. He did not perform calm or project authority. He simply sat and let Soli re-anchor to his warmth the way she re-anchored to Marin's, and for a time the three of them looked at the book of animals while the storm argued with the windows. Soli fell asleep between them, gradually and completely, as children do. They looked at her, and then they looked at each other across her sleeping form, and the kitchen was warm and gold and full of the smell of spiced milk and old stone, and Marin thought, "Here it is. This is the thing that has been building," because she had been careful enough to feel it arrive, rather than be surprised by it. "She trusts you completely," he said very quietly. "She's allowed to," Marin said. He looked at her. "That sounds like a philosophy." "It is." She smoothed a strand of hair from Soli's forehead. "Everyone is allowed to trust the people who mean to stay. The hard part is being one of those people." "I have not always been," he said. Not as a confession requiring absolution, just as a fact he was prepared to say aloud now. "You're becoming one," she said. "I've watched it happen." "You watch carefully." His voice was low, unhurried. The storm made sound against the glass. "I have no wolf speed," she said, with the ease of someone at peace with the fact. "I have always only had watching." He reached across Soli's sleeping weight and touched the back of Marin's hand, just the backs of his fingers against the backs of hers, barely and completely, and he said, "I see you, Marin, clearly. I think I have been finding my way to seeing you clearly for some time." She looked at his hand, and she thought of her grandmother's saying, and she felt it uncurl from behind her ribs, where she had kept it, felt it expand into the warm air of the kitchen, felt it arrive. "I know," she said. "I've been watching you get there." He laughed, a real laugh, brief and startled and good, and something in the house shifted, some long-held note finally resolving. Chapter 8. What Gets Built. Spring came to Thornreach in stages, the way it comes to stone places, reluctantly and then all at once, like a decision made slowly and implemented suddenly. Valdric did not declare himself in any grand or formal way. He was a man relearning the language of small gestures, and he practiced it carefully. A winter flower from the garden left on the table where she took her morning tea. An evening in the library where the stated purpose was reading, and the actual purpose was the comfortable proximity of being near her. A walk in the garden where he asked her about Call, her brother, and she told him about the bone fever and the clinic costs, and he listened without the brisk problem-solving that powerful men often used in place of witness, and then, when she had finished, he simply said, "He's lucky in his sister." The clinic costs, she discovered a fortnight later, had been anonymously settled for the next 2 years by a donation from an unspecified benefactor, and she went to him with the letter in her hand and a feeling in her chest that was larger than she had prepared for. "You didn't need to do that," she said, standing in his study doorway. He looked up from his work. "I know." His voice was level, honest. "It was an obligation. I needed to do something with what I felt, and that was the most useful shape it took." She looked at him for a long time. Outside the window, the first of the spring trees had come into color. "I don't want to be a problem you've solved," she said, because this was the thing that needed saying. "You are not," he said, and he stood and crossed the room, which took effort in that large room. It was a deliberate thing, a crossing of distance, and stopped in front of her. "You are the reason I remembered what it means to be in the same room as someone, rather than simply occupying the same building. That is not a problem. That is the only good thing I've been given the chance to understand in a very long time." She had been careful. She had been careful about this specifically, because she knew the territory of being useful to powerful people. And she knew how easily useful becomes mistaken for precious, and she had not wanted that. She had wanted to be seen, not solved. But she was seen. She had been watching him learn to see her, and he had learned it. He had learned it in the garden, and in the kitchen, and in the hallway, and in the study, and in every ordinary place where she had simply been herself, without decoration. And he had gotten there by real work, and she trusted what real work produced. She stepped forward and closed the remaining distance herself, which seemed right, and when she put her hand against his chest, she felt his heartbeat, quick and present and entirely honest. There was nothing grand about the beginning of it. There was just the study and the spring window, and the feeling of being exactly, specifically, correctly seen. Epilogue. 1 year later, the market in Ashvin's lower quarter was not so different from what it had always been. The fishmonger still called too loudly. The bread seller still undercounted change in her own favor. But the hiring board near the east gate had, over the past year, acquired a slightly odd reputation. People said it was the board where Marin Voss had found the posting that changed her life, which was not quite the story, but was not quite wrong either. The true version was that Marin Voss had found the posting and had brought herself to it, had brought everything she was, all the watching patience and the wordless competence and the grandmother's saying carried like a candle flame behind the ribs, and the rest had been built from that, slowly, in ordinary rooms. On this November morning, exactly 1 year since she had read the cream-colored card in this very spot, Marin was not in the lower market. She was in the garden at Thornreach, standing in the cold sunlight with Soli, who was 7 now and conducting a very important ceremony. Tomb the rabbit, the real Tomb, the shy garden rabbit who had become decidedly less shy over the course of the year, was receiving a gift of winter carrot ends, which Soli was presenting one at a time with the formality of a dignitary presenting honors. In the pocket of Marin's coat was a small watercolor painting in a wooden frame. Not the one from the east wing. That one lived properly on Soli's wall now, where it had always belonged. This was a different one, made by Soli's own hands last week, in imitation of her mother's style and her own subject. A rabbit with extremely long ears, labeled in printing that was more confident now, Tomb, and in the corner, in the careful lettering of someone who had only recently learned to write cursive, a small inscription, for Marin, who stayed. Marin had found it on her pillow the morning after Valdric had placed a ring on her finger, in the same kitchen where the three of them had waited out the winter storm together, a ring of pale silver set with a gray stone, simple and exact. And she had held the small painting, and felt the full, complete, arrived weight of her grandmother's saying, "A candle does not need to be a bonfire to light the dark." She had not had wolf speed or pack glory, or any of the blazing attributes the world had spent her whole life suggesting she ought to have. She had had patience, and watching, and the particular warmth of a woman who had never agreed to extinguish herself, just because no one powerful had thought to look. And in a house full of grief and locked rooms, and a little girl hiding under beds, she had been exactly, precisely, more than enough. Valdric came through the garden gate with his coat not quite buttoned and a cup of tea in each hand, and she watched him stop to observe Soli's ceremony with the rabbit, watched the quiet amusement cross his face, watched him see his daughter completely, the specific child, and not the general shape of one. And she thought, this is the thing we built. This, here, in this garden, in the cold. He reached her and offered the tea, and she took it, and they stood together watching the very important ceremony conclude, as Tomb accepted the last piece of carrot with great dignity, and departed. Soli looked up at them both, with her gray eyes warm. "He's less shy now," she announced. "He learned," Marin said, and felt Valdric's hand find hers in the folds of her coat. "That it's safe to stay." She had the painting in her pocket. She had the ring on her hand. She had the saying, finally, released from its long keeping, not behind her ribs, but here, out in the cold light, proved true and whole. The candle had been enough. It had always been enough. End.